Welcome to Illuminati Silver. We tell you the truth about silver. Today is Tuesday, the 2nd of October 2018, and we're briefly commenting on an article written in Financial World this month entitled Quantitative Easing, The End of the Big Easy by Paul Wallace. Paul Wallace is the former European economics editor of The Economist magazine and the author of The Euro Experiment, published by Cambridge University Press. Details listed in the description below this video. Financial World is the monthly publication which members like us of the London Institute of Banking and Finance receive, which discusses topics specifically relating to banking and finance. It's a serious publication, really, for bankers and banking students, but it addresses a range of subjects not normally found easily on the internet, and certainly almost never covered by the pumping sites, which are only interested in lambasting bankers and demanding that you buy as much gold and silver as you possibly can today. But banking has many aspects. And whilst investment bankers and speculators undoubtedly have contributed their fair share to our economic woes, there are also aspects of banking which have, to some extent, enabled the West to have levels of prosperity not seen or experienced in other parts of the world. Anyway, the purpose of today's video is to analyze Paul's article, in which he discusses the phasing out of QE in major economies and asks how effective has the policy actually been. We shall quote a small part of the article. It runs as follows, quote, "An extraordinary experiment is drawing to a close. Led by the US Federal Reserve, central banks embarked upon quantitative easing, or QE, which is buying financial assets with newly created money, in response to the 2008 banking crisis. By the end of 2017, the Fed, ECB, European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, and Bank of England had together made $11 trillion of purchases. Now the Fed is leading the way in phasing out QE. The ECB, the last big central bank to adopt the policy, will stop its purchases at the end of this year. What has the experiment proved? One thing it has certainly shown is that central banks can do more than move short-term interest rates, their main policy tool. They resorted to QE precisely because they had already brought short-term rates down as far as possible in their efforts to foster a recovery after the deep crisis-induced recession and to combat deflationary pressures. That limit is set by the zero bound, arising from the fact that depositors charged negative rates can switch into cash, which at least does not lose money. Although both the ECB and the Bank of Japan pushed rates below zero, their foray into negative territory was limited. QE broke new ground by enabling central banks to bring down long-term interest rates, such as yields on bonds with maturities of 10 years or more. Previously, they had been able to affect long-term rates only, indirectly as markets incorporated changes in current and expected short-term rates into bond yields. Indeed, when long-term rates failed to respond to the steady tightening in US monetary policy in the mid-2000s, the Fed's long-serving chairman Alan Greenspan called it a conundrum. Unquote. Whilst the impact of QE was difficult to assess, as different measures provided differing results with no absolutely clear pattern, we quote a little further from the article. Quote, "In general, the policy tends to depreciate currencies, but there are other effects too. Research by the Bank of England in 2016 suggested, for example, that the Fed's QE had a powerful impact on equity prices in the United Kingdom. Whether or not the Bank of England or the Fed was responsible, the rebound in UK financial markets during the first phase of the Bank of England's QE was remarkable. Equity prices rose by 50% between March 2009 and May 2010, while the spreads between corporate bonds and government bonds narrowed sharply over the same period. The rally might not have been wholly because of QE, but it is hard to imagine that it would have happened without it. Even so, the wider effect of QE on the economy has been more modest than many originally expected. The Bank of England's purchase of gilts eventually reached £435 billion, but fears that the policy would ignite inflation proved to be well off the mark. Inflation has recently been above the 2% target in the UK, but that mainly reflects the big devaluation in sterling following the vote to leave the EU. Inflation was around zero in 2015 and a mere 0.5% in June 2016 when the referendum was held. In the Eurozone, the ECB has more than doubled the scale of its asset purchase programme, from 1.1 trillion euros to 2.6 trillion euros. The buying, originally due to run from March 2015 to September 2016, has been extended in stages to the end of 2018. Yet inflationary pressures remain subdued. The headline rate has recently gone above the bank's target of below but close to 2%. But that is mainly because of higher energy prices. Core inflation, which strips out volatile components such as food and energy, is only around 1%, little higher than at the end of 2014 when it stood at 0.7%. Unquote. Paul further points out that no country in the world has adopted QE more aggressively or for a longer period of time than Japan, which began theirs back in 2001 and is still continuing with it, with its 10-year bond rate today standing at 0%. Now, this next part of his article is very important. Quote, "Despite these apparently modest effects, it can be argued that QE, together with rock-bottom interest rates, averted a disaster. The Bank of England estimated that the initial £200 billion of QE pushed up GDP, gross domestic product, by between 1.5% and 2%, and inflation by 0.75 to 1.5%. The ECB calculates that its measures, mainly QE, between mid-2014 and October 2017 will have pushed up GDP and inflation by 1.9 percentage points cumulatively between 2016 and 2020. No central bank is keen to highlight one of the most important effects of QE, its impact on the public finances. Governments have benefited from lower interest rates on new borrowing since the purchases began. Although national treasuries continue to pay interest on the bonds bought through QE, they also gain from the bumper profits they get from their central banks, which are financing the purchases at negligible interest rates. Although many Germans rail at the ECB's policy, its effect in lowering borrowing costs has contributed to Germany's budget surplus and falling public debt." Unquote. He then continues with this conclusion, quote, "QE has shaped financial markets in the past decade and will continue to do so for years to come. The purchases may be ending, although not yet in Japan, but central banks will retain bloated balance sheets for a long time. The ECB is set to follow the Bank of England in preventing any automatic rundown in the assets it holds by continuing to repurchase the amount that matures. The Fed is the only big central bank that is actually shrinking its pile of assets. It is doing so not through direct sales, but by gradually reducing the amount of maturing debt it repurchases. For the time being, the experiment appears to have worked, but it is too soon to reach a definitive judgment. The worry about QE is that, together with ultra-low interest rates, it has fostered a renewal of the risky behavior that led to the financial crisis in the first place. There are also arguments that it has increased inequality by massively boosting the wealth of asset holders. If the happy days end in tears, again, the final verdict on QE may be that it worked too well for its own good. Unquote. Now, perhaps from this article by a serious financial commentator and author to the senior people within the industry, the general consensus is that the US is certainly, for the near future, determined to rein back its QE, thereby further strengthening the US dollar compared with other world currencies, as its foreign counterparts are still to some extent dependent on such policies. This is one of the main reasons why we are not convinced yet that the US dollar has had its day, and that whether one feels QE should have been introduced or not, the reality is that it's there and shall continue to be there for some time to come. With President Trump, assuming he remains in power long enough, following a US first policy, and the Fed determined upon higher interest rates well into 2019, we are confident, at least for this decade, the US dollar will remain supreme. And what we have to attempt to calculate, taking this as well as a myriad of other factors into account, is the effect on gold and silver prices. If left to this one factor alone, it would press heavily down upon them, despite the fact that they are already at relatively low levels, and especially compared with 2011. We hope you have found this video interesting and informative, and if so, please give it a thumbs up and share it on Twitter. Please ensure that you have subscribed to our channel and press the bell sign so that you are notified of any future videos. Also, kindly visit our website at illuminatisilver.com, and if you haven't already done so, please subscribe as a free member for regular email updates and offers. Disclaimer: Illuminati Silver owners come from a background of banking, international wealth management and economics. Having now retired from these worlds, we are not qualified to give investment advice. Therefore, this and other productions must not be deemed to be giving such advice, and merely represent the personal views of its owners.